Testing. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1. It's good. Okay, we're good. We're good. That's for the live stream. We're good. We're good. As long as it's
Aspettiamo che entrano. Sì. Sì, prima che entra il rettore non possiamo cominciare. Do il benvenuto a tutti, specialmente all'ambasciatrice, la dottoressa Tamara, della Georgia presso la Santa Sede, e poi alla vice ambasciatrice, dottoressa Joanna K. Gunduz, della ambasciata britannica presso la Santa Sede, e poi a tutti noi, ecco, che siamo venuti per ascoltare un discorso qualificato su Gerusalemme e l'Oriente cristiano. Do ovviamente il più caloroso benvenuto a lui, ma perché non resta con parole, leggo allora il mio piccolo benvenuto. Gesù è nato 4 anni prima di Cristo ed è morto fuori della città santa di Gerusalemme. La città porta l'impronta del suo figlio più illustre ma più controverso. La grande speranza che desta Gerusalemme sembra morire prima ancora del nascere. A lungo andare, la città madre di tutte le chiese rischia di diventare attorno al suo sepolcro un campo di battaglia. Questo non è tutto. Giovanni Paolo II, in visita al Pio nel 1993, ha detto, conversando con i professori, il problema del primato è dovuto a Pietro, perché ha lasciato Gerusalemme. Questo pensiero mi dà i brividi. Come sarà se il suo successore davvero dovesse tornarvi? In effetti, Vladimir Solovyov immagina la riunione delle chiese avverarsi a Gerusalemme sulla soglia del giudizio universale, con un pugno di cattolici attorno a Pietro II, un pugno di ortodossi attorno all'egumeno Giovanni e un pugno di protestanti attorno al professor Pauli. È bello essere amati da tutti, ma il guaio qui è che quasi tutti vogliono Gerusalemme per se stessi. Gerusalemme è città santa per gli ebrei che la celebrano il Yom Kippur e la sera del Seder, è città santa per i musulmani a causa del viaggio mistico notturno di Maometto che lo porta in paradiso, è città santa per i cristiani che con l'Apocalisse la venerano come la Gerusalemme celeste. Nessuna divisione è nata nella Gerusalemme terrestre. Le divisioni che affliggono la città sono state importate. La Gerusalemme celeste è un dono, scende dal cielo come la pace tra le chiese è un dono, tanto sorprendente quanto immeritato. Davanti a questo pluralismo, toccare il tema di Gerusalemme è come toccare una mina, a meno che uno non sia particolarmente destro a disinnescarla. Uno dei pochissimi che possono farlo è il professor Anthony O'Mahony, che però, al contrario della città santa, sembra essere l'esperto di un solo tema. Non l'avevo conosciuto personalmente, eppure un articolo dopo l'altro indicava che difatti si muoveva sull'ampio ventaglio che da un punto ingloba tutto il resto. Mostra ancora una volta che nell'antichità, ma ancora oggi, tutte le strade portano a Gerusalemme, seppur in maniera diversa da Roma. Inoltre, un vero studioso è spesso il pensatore di una sola idea chiave che domina tutto il resto. Il professor O'Mahony ha acquistato in breve tempo una maestria senza pari su quel groviglio di rapporti che caratterizza il Medio Oriente per ciò che riguarda le chiese e specialmente la Chiesa cattolica. Nato a Londra, ha studiato a Oxford per poi essere cooptato dai gesuiti di Heathrow College, Londra. Da lì ha dispiegato una grande attività di scrittore, il che include sia varie monografie intere, sia circa 70 articoli scientifici, ma anche una instancabile editoria di simposi e giornate di studio. Menziono solo a titolo d'esempio Christianity in the Middle East, Studies in Modern History, Theology and Politics, Londra 2008, come anche The Catholic Church in the Contemporary Middle East, Londra 2010, che ha redatto assieme a John Flannery. Si è anche dato da fare con gli studi pubblicati dal centro Michal Latzko, gesuita antico professore del Pio, di cui è stato l'editore del volume 13 della serie Orientali et Occidentalia con il titolo The Primacy of the Pope in Catholic Orthodox Dialogue, Corsice 2013. È direttore del Center of Middle Eastern Studies di Heathrow e anche Research Fellow alla Blackfriars University dell'Università di Oxford. Questo felice connubio di acribia accademica e chiara affiliazione cattolica lo distingue tra altri studiosi che privilegiano o l'uno o l'altro filone. Essere un veterano, seppur solo accademicamente, di tanti conflitti, ti fa tirare certe condizioni, anche perché il professor Mahoney è molto richiesto per conferenze di livello internazionale su temi simili. Direi, inevitabile non è la guerra, inevitabile è la pace. La pace passa attraverso il conflitto. La pace si trova in questo mondo in mezzo al conflitto. La pace di Cristo è come Lui stesso, un segno di contraddizione, forse la miglior definizione dello status di Gerusalemme. Adesso passo la parola al professor Anthony O'Mahony.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank very much the Rector of the Pontifical Oriental Institute, Father David Nazar, for his very kind invitation to give the Sir Daniel and Countess Bernadine Murphy Donohue Chair for 2008. And secondly, I'd like to thank Father Edward Farrugia for his warm and very, very, very generous words indeed. I've had the privilege over the last few days to have some time with some of the students and the academic staff of the Pontifical Oriental Institute, discussing and reflecting upon the modern history, the ecclesial identity and the character of Christianity in Jerusalem and the wider Middle East. It occurred to me that there is only two places in the world where you can study and witness the rich complexity and diversity of the Christian East. One is in Jerusalem, and the other is here in the Pontifical Oriental Institute. The Institute, along with the Congregation for Oriental Churches, which celebrated their centenary last year, 2017, to my mind, I think that we should be profoundly grateful to the founders of for their fundamental intuition to bring here into Rome a place of study and research for Christianity, the Eastern Christian churches. My reflection today, well, my lecture today really is a series of thoughts. I did say a mélange of reflections, a collection of thoughts on Jerusalem and Eastern Christianity, and I've called it Presence, Encounter and Challenge. Jerusalem is at the intersection of the sacred religious idea of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. In modern times, the historical vocation of Jerusalem has been identified as a meeting place for Judaism, Christianity and Islam. The encounter of these three religions in a city which represents a shared sacred space continues to present a challenge for their peaceful coexistence. Today, the question of the identity of Jerusalem has come to have an international role of great importance and sensitivity. To borrow an image from the icon, that is, this place, Jerusalem, is more than simply a place, just as an icon is more than simply a representation. Jerusalem represents the confrontation between a shocking challenge of the particular and the universal. In the claims of the three so-called Abrahamic traditions, neither Judaism, Christianity or Islam, who share Jerusalem, can dispense with history, time, and presence, space of the other, which marks the Holy Land sacred to these three traditions. I wanted to bring a few Eastern Christian thinkers into our conversation on the character of Jerusalem, and I think we should start off possibly with Louis Massignon. Louis Massignon, this French Catholic scholar of Islam, Melkite Greek Catholic priest, ordained in Cairo in 1950, a religious political mystic, is undoubtedly a man of his time who's really quite difficult to contextualize. However, throughout his life, Massignon concentrated his reflection around the charter of Abraham and the problem of Abraham's relationship with God. Within this initial Abrahamic framework, Jerusalem gradually entered the thoughts in his reflections. His religious instincts converged on the Abrahamic principle that shaped his conception of the relations among the three monotheistic religions, as well as grounding his concept of peace in the Holy Land and in the entire world. The concept, the idea of Abrahamic religions, lies with Louis Massignon. In fact, we might consider as a sign of contradiction which separates what divides these religions, shine forth in their most visible and symbolic way. As one scholar has opined, the historical vocation of Jerusalem is to be a meeting place of three religions, continuing to relaunch the challenge of their peaceful coexistence within the same physical space. However, there remains a powerful dialectic at the axial point of the Jerusalem question, that is between the presence and power in regard to the place deemed holy. Understanding this reality is difficult exercise, especially in the context of a highly charged and dynamic situation marked by political and religious conflict in the wider Middle East. Thus, remarked one scholar, whoever holds power and place requires power for it to be held, only a holy place will soon realize that embracing the presence of those whose lives and memory make it holy is the only way to peaceful coexistence. Father Thomas Stransky, the emeritus rector of the Tantor Ecumenical Institute, reflecting on what he called the crisis of religion in the Holy Land, outlined the danger. Quoting the English poet Auden, he says, like the frost that halts the flood of thinking, and continues, as all hungry history consumes the presence and dulls the imaginations and appetite for dreams and the future. The continuing need for creative religious thought in this context from the global religious community is palpable. This includes a Christian vision embedded in the texture and the character of Jerusalem, which is able to sustain a wider understanding of religious faith and practice articulated in the historical landscape of the Holy Land, making sacred space both present yet holding the universal idea in dialogue with the world. Some consider that Jerusalem question contains two separate elements, sovereignty over the city and the status of the holy places. However, this conceptualization only takes us so far, for the place cannot remain holy very long without people whose memory and presence confirm that holiness. The Christian presence in Jerusalem has been significantly challenged in the context of political change, ethnic conflict and displacement. One of the main consequences has been that the Christian communities of Jerusalem have lost their wider hinterland of connection with Eastern Christian churches across the Middle Eastern region today. Jerusalem had once been the center of a complex web of linkages with the broad expanse of the religious cultures which make up the Christian East of the Holy City. This included chapels, hospices, pilgrim routes which brought peoples from across the region to the Holy City. This can be clearly seen, for example, if you visit the Church of St. James in the Armenian Quarter in Jerusalem. If anyone has been there, it's quite an extraordinary place of memory. There's a great Armenian tradition of bringing to the holy places gifts from different communities all around the wider Armenian world. And there's sanctuary lamps, there's doors. And as we know, after the Armenian genocide, many of these communities disappeared. And it becomes a place of memory. But also it represents the history of the wider Christian community or the Armenian community in the region. And also really, I was taken on a tour from Jerusalem, following all the pilgrim hostels of the Armenian community, the Chapel of St. George's in Ramla, and ending at the Monastery of St. Nicholas in Jaffa. And you understood that many of these chapels linked many of the pilgrims who came to Jaffa, many of the ports, or came from the north through Aleppo, or right into the Holy City. That these chapels, these hospices, represented a web which held the wider Eastern Christian East to the holy places themselves. It was quite, for me, a very powerful moment. In fact, nearly all the Eastern Catholic churches and chapels of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, Armenian, Chaldean, Maronite, Melkite, Syriac, were all established in the 19th and early 20th century as part of the ecclesial renewal and revival in the late Ottoman Empire before 1917. In fact, it is in the 19th century, particularly it's the second half of that era, that the idea of Holy Russia, conceptualized in the medieval text presenting Russia as the second Jerusalem, or the third Rome, was revived and given new expression. The construction of the vast Russian compound outside the old city, or Alexander Nevsky Church, close to the Holy Sepulchre, are physical witnesses to a religious revival before 1914. Today, what is astonishing is the return of Russian pilgrims to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Since the ending of the Soviet Union in 1991, they number hundreds of thousands every year. We can think of other Christian churches of new states, such as the Georgian state, where the whole question of its relationship with the Holy Land has become a very important part of the ecclesial and religious renewal of identity. So the ending of what's happened in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe has also been about reconnection with Jerusalem. And I think we need to be aware of that, see it in a historical perspective. We might wish to stop and consider the intimate connection between the presence of the revival of global Christianity and its connection with Jerusalem, both in its historical manifestations and today. What I've just mentioned in relationship to Russia could equally be applied to Christian Ethiopia during the late 19th and 20th century. I would like to add a further point, that the place of that Jerusalem has also been a place of refuge for Eastern Christian communities confronted with the violent upheaval of the modern era. I mentioned the Armenians, or the Syriac Christians, or the Ethiopians, from genocide and massacre brought about by the creation of homogeneous nation states, or by colonial ventures, who remembers that Rastafari or Emperor Haile Selassie, fleeing from the Italians, arrived in Jerusalem in 1924. The well-known British scholar of Russia and its religious tradition published an account in 1910 with Russian pilgrims to Jerusalem, describing the culture which had changed, which was about to change in 1910. And he says there were roughly 10,000 Russian pilgrims in Jerusalem at that point. So, one of the great challenges today is to reimagine Jerusalem as a central element of the Eastern Christian world of the Middle East today. Today, Christianity in the Middle East is experiencing a profound crisis, which is challenging its long-term presence in the region. The question of Christian presence in Jerusalem is part of this context. In the history of the religious landscape of the Middle East, we might recall that in 1910, Christians composed roughly 14 to 15% of the population of the region. However, today it's 4%. Todd Johnson, a leading demographic historian of the region, considers that this proportion could decline to 3.6% in 2025, whilst noting that the figure could be much lower if the flight of Christians of Iraq and Syria continues. In fact, you could say the wider Middle East is becoming more Muslim, with the percentage increasing from 85% in 1910 to 93 or 95% in 2010. The depluralization of the region is one of the principal forces for change and destabilization. Today, approximately 20% of the global Muslim community and 30 to 40% of the world Jewish community live within the Middle East. However, less than 1% of Christians are present in this part of Western Asia. Father Samir Khalil Samir of the Pontifical Oriental Institute positions the significance of Middle Eastern Christianity due to their cultural richness, the proud of their apostolic origins at the beginning of Christianity, a rejection of the term minority, an understanding of their vocation to be a unifying bridge between cultures, civilizations, and religions east and west. The idea that Christians in the Middle East are representatives of a minority is very much contested, as it reduces the character of the region, which is defined by religious plurality, not just by majority or minority markers. That said, Todd Johnson again has noted that one of the most profound changes to have taken place in the global religious landscape has been the unrelenting proportional decline of the historic Christian communities in the Middle East. Contemporary challenges of Christian presence in the region might be liaised with the crisis in the imagination of the global Christianity, in understanding the implications of this reality, despite the fact that today we live in an extraordinary moment when it's estimated that Christians today account for close to a third of humanity. At no point in historical memory has one religious tradition as Christianity today been so vast and so geographically spread. The crisis is not mirrored in Judaism or Islam in the Middle East. The sacred sites of Judaism in Jerusalem and for Islam in the holy places of the Arabian Peninsula are assured of a living and strong co-religious presence. However, this cannot be said for Christian holy places and territory, which are seeing their communities decline in number, leading to a less secure future. The ecclesial context for the Middle Eastern Christianity is one of great complexity. Its origins are those of Christianity itself, expressed in a deep cultural, linguistic, and theological diversity. Middle Eastern Christianity, despite the small part of global Christianity, certainly less than 1%, has a significance and an importance for the wider Christian tradition. Sidney Griffith, in his well-known book, The Church in the Shadow of the Mosque, however, notes the Middle East for the history of Christianity thus: "It is important, to quote, to take cognizance of the seldom acknowledged fact that after the consolidation of the Islamic conquest and the consequent withdrawal of the Roman Byzantine forces from the Fertile Crescent in the first half of the 7th century, perhaps 50% of all world's confessing Christians from the mid-7th to the early 11th centuries lived within this region." I would like to posit a conceptual proposition from the dialogue between the Oriental Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church, which was proven to be one of the most fruitful of ecumenical exchanges. In considering the way forward to reimagine a future relationship between these two ecclesial communities, it was posited that maybe these churches might consider what held these churches in communion, for example, how they recognized saints in common and their respective liturgies and letters addressed from one church to the other, or in monastic exchange prior to the Council of Chalcedon. Might today we be presented with a similar challenge to reimagine how the Christian East has connected Jerusalem, particularly within the wider Middle East, in recent times. Again, returning to Thomas Strancy, who continues in his essay, The Crisis of Religion in the Holy Land. The strong memory of selective past events breeds distrust of the future. The future could become different from what the future used to be. Jerusalem has also been the witness of a central act, or the axle point of the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. The meeting between Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras in January 1964 is such a significant act. When we think about the modern papacy, every single pope since Paul VI, apart from John Paul I, has gone to Jerusalem as part of the itinerary, the new, you could say, pontifical liturgy of the modern papacy. John Paul II in 2000, Benedict XVI in 2009, and Francis in 2010. Lev Gillet, the monk of the Easters, called 1892 to 1918, who had been one of the most strategic figures in the relations between East and Western churches, starting with his association with Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky in his Unionist monastic project, reflected on the encounter between Paul and Athenagoras in the review Irenicon, to quote, "Jerusalem, these simple syllables, this name so charged with emotion, has been for the last 2 weeks on the lips of men, and in their writings, thoughts more than it has been for centuries. A meeting took place there which constitutes a great historical event, the opening up of new perspectives. Jerusalem, the place of convergence, the place of dialogue, divine mission assigned to the Holy See. This mission in the last week being manifested in the world in an astonishing manner. When two men of goodwill, one representing the most numerous part of the Christian East and the other the most numerous part of the Christian West, met and shared in fraternal embrace. in these places holy to the three religions of the book. Gillette had an intimate sense, to quote, that of a profound unity over and above the historical aspirations, for the responsibility was shared between the theological differences between churches of East and West, a unity recognition of which could give rise to a renew of Christian life. Paul VI and the Catholic Church re-centered itself on Jerusalem, providing an opportunity to engage with the churches of the Christian East. I think Paul's pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1964 is still one of the most extraordinary events in modern times. Paul declares that he's going to Jerusalem in early December, I think it's December the 4th, 1963, and says, I'm going to be there in a month's time. We have no diplomatic relations with Israel or Jordan. We still dispute the idea of what Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem is. I've never met an ecumenical patriarch. I've never thought on Islam or Judaism. I've never engaged with the Armenian Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem. However, I'm going to be there in Jerusalem in a month's time, and I hope we will be able to achieve all of that. It's an extraordinary moment, and I think we should return to that. It's a wonderful moment, and they're still deciding when and how Ethnagorius and Paul VI will actually meet. And there's a meeting with the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan in London, and he goes to Rome, and they sit there and discuss what's going to happen. And the Metropolitan sits back and he says, well, maybe we can see it this way. It seems that you may have been called to climb the same mountain, the mountain of the Lord. Your Holiness is climbing the mountain on one side, and the ecumenical patriarch on the other. Those who understand the meaning of this daring enterprise are praying that both men will meet at the summit, on the ground sanctified by their common Redeemer. Holy places. Holy places are essential to the character of the city of Jerusalem. Holy places have charted the contours of the relationship with the wider religious and political world. The holy places have also ordered the relationship between Jews, Christians and Muslims, depending on the context of the governance of the holy city. The future status of Jerusalem is, as we know, a very complex issue. The shared sacred space in Jerusalem illustrates that, you could say, disputed territory, which is often is intertwined, even multi-layered, can be shared. I think we should think that Jerusalem is the only place, the only holy place in the world where both the three religious traditions cohabit together. It's of unique importance. It should be stated openly that a literary application of the status quo to the city of Jerusalem is, of course, impossible. Differences of scale and complexity are significant for one regulating relations between different Christian churches who share a common site is one thing. Seeking to accommodate the shared sacred space between different religions in a city which has significant symbolic religions in the city, which has significant symbolic religious and political importance for the global communities of Jews, Christians and Muslims, is another matter. It might be mentioned that on the whole, Christians do not share significant sacred sites with either Jews or Muslims, but Jews and Muslims do share sacred sites in Jerusalem. That said, one should say clearly that the creative solution to an extraordinary complex problem should not be an unthought matter. In the modern history, various solutions have been posited, however, generally for the future of Jerusalem. Generally, three scenarios have come forward. An international city governed by an international organization of council of religious leaders rather than any claimant nations, a unified city under the sovereignty of one state, or a shared or joint city in which both states share sovereignty. It has often been considered that the most effective framework to preserve the sanctity of Jerusalem and the holy sites would be to depoliticize the city through internationalization of the old city or the wider Jerusalem area, which is the corpus separatum envisaged by the United Nations in the 1947 partition recommendation. However, it was never implemented. In a very interesting article by Chad Emmett, The Status Quo Solution for Jerusalem, he says that the relationship between the various Christian churches in Jerusalem and the Holy Land, vis-a-vis the question of the holy places, is often posited in the context throughout history of the various churches have vied with each other to either maintain or gain the various sanctuaries. Indeed, we can say that sharing sovereignty of political territory is not practiced often. It seems to be the only reasonable solution, according to Chad Emmett, for the complex issue of Jerusalem. Using the holy places of Jerusalem as a model, Emmett shows that how sharing sacred space, albeit on a small scale, can be done peacefully. For more than a century, Greeks, Latins, Armenian Copts have shared and Syriacs have shared the Holy Sepulchre, and an interlocking system of scattered sovereignty. The modern idea associated with the status quo is the issuing by the Ottoman authorities of the Firman, or edict, for the holy places in 1852. The status quo was given further legitimacy by being included in the 1858 Paris Peace Convention, the 1878 Treaty of Berlin, and the Versailles Treaty. And it was under the British mandate, who were given the mandate, as part of the mandate was to create a Holy Places Commission. And it was during that time, when the status quo was extended to include all holy sites. I'd like to bring my reflections to an end now, because I'll try to cover a number of areas. One, the importance of the Holy City for the relationship between the religious communities today. How, at one point, how Jerusalem is linked into the wider Christian, Eastern Christian world of the Middle East today. It's still a very important question. I looked at the questions of ecumenism. Ecumenism is so important for the identity of the modern Catholic Church, but increasingly for many of the Eastern Christian churches. And then I gave a few thoughts on holy places. Often it's posited in a way that the conflictual relationship between the different Christian communities in the holy place is a witness to their disunity. We could look at it a slightly different way. They have found a way to share holy places in a very difficult context where both history and disunity have made their relationships at times quite difficult. And I think that's an important point. So, in my talk today on Jerusalem, I consider we have a witness of a convergence of ideas and contexts. One, Jerusalem is where the sacred narratives intersect between each of the other, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. No other city does this occur in the same way. The uniqueness of Jerusalem cannot be reproduced. However, it has a privileged space for the encounter between the religions. In the age of growing global religious nationalism, the character and the texture of relations between the different religions in Jerusalem will continue to have a profound influence. Louis Massignon, who I quoted early on, considered Jerusalem as the kindergarten of humanity. We should also recall that ecumenism has a strategic value and is not just a formality, but a way of survival and charity at one level, but a plural-driven identity as a witness in opposition to rigid, often ideological nationalism. For the churches since 1964, for the Catholic Church, and for increasing for all the churches of the East, the papal pilgrimage has provided an opportunity for the religious leadership of both Eastern and Western churches to renew their commitment to ecumenism at the source of their common faith. The question of sharing the sacred sites, which has often been articulated again, is a very important question. Jerusalem is a living icon to the diversity of Christianity. The gospel lived through culture, expressed itself in many different languages. This is vividly recognized and witnessed in the Eastern Christian world of Jerusalem. It is a plurality in the Middle East which is being significantly challenged today. And what I'd like to really make a plea at the very end of my reflections is to think that Jerusalem is, particularly in its Eastern Christian complexity, is a character of religious belonging and relationships, which really is a profound witness to the wider Middle East today, where we're actually beginning to see the depluralization of the region, and hence the instability associated with that. Living together in the context of Jerusalem between the three different religions, but also how the Christian communities, despite their differences, have sought to accommodate each other and live with each other, also part of the growing ecumenical movement, I think is a real point of that we need to reflect upon today, because I think it has a great significance for the wider Christian tradition in the world today, but also for the relations between the religions today. I'd like to also, my final point is that there really is a crisis in the global Christian imagination around Christianity in the Middle East. Christianity was born in the area. Jerusalem is of great significance. Antioch was where Christians were first called Christians. However, global Christianity still struggles to relate to the Christian East. However, as we know, through diaspora, between displacement, Eastern Christianities are re-pluralizing or pluralizing the wider Christian world. Jerusalem is an important question in this regard. I'd say that the Eastern Christian communities, the identity of Eastern Christianity in Jerusalem today, as appointed to the wider Middle East, is of great strategic importance today, which should be noted. So thank you very much.
Voglio, I wish to thank Professor Anthony O'Mahony for having given us what, for myself, is a slightly different version of things. Namely, that our churches have started in Jerusalem. One of the few experts here who have taken that up was Vincenzo Poggi in a relatively short book, but he begins with Jerusalem. Usually you would say, well, the first few centuries, especially the first, you'd better not touch, no? So, and as an example which you touched and which I greatly appreciated was that you said even the Pio, you know, two places where you can study plurality, Jerusalem and the Pio. Actually, the Pio exists because of the Congress of 1893, Eucharistic Congress of 1893. The Easterners, the patriarchs, Yusuf especially, complained so badly with Cardinal Langenieux, the legate of the Pope, that the Pope next year called a conference of all the patriarchs, from which derives the letter, the most famous letter about the East, perhaps, Dignitatis Orientalium Dignitas, which is called the Magna Carta of the East. And from there, you see, he formed a group of cardinals, which eventually, but directly, led to the foundation of the Institute in 1917. That is very important. Perhaps I would have said there are many more contacts, lectionaries, the Georgian, and many things have contacts with Jerusalem theologically. But so I thank you very much. I liked very much too this idea of the status quo of 1850. And there I wish to make my first question in order to break the ice. You know, it is sometimes said that under the Turks, for exactly 400 years, from 1517 to 1917, under the Ottomans, more precisely, there was relative peace. Then it fell into the hands of the Christians, and there has been perpetual war. Have you any idea, could you give us any illumination of this fact?
Gosh. Ottoman rule, as you rightly say, was for 4 centuries. Muslim rule was even longer than that. And if you go back further, we have the Crusaders and the Byzantine rule. So Jerusalem itself has gone through a whole series of different type of governance, but also of rule. The Ottoman period is interesting, and I'm not going to get into the deep consideration of the Ottoman period. However, I think this whole question of the status quo, we know that the status quo, the 19th century, was a period when the Holy Land was rediscovered. The 19th century is a period of great revival within global Christianity. I mentioned Russia, Ethiopia, but right across the Western world. And any of you who visit Jerusalem today, or nearly all the institutions were either established in the late 19th century or the early 20th century. And they constructed churches, hospices, schools. It's all part of the Great Revival. And we know that the whole question of the status quo, who are you going to share holy places, brought in international relations into the Holy Land for one of the first times. I think we're moving into a new world where the whole question of the status of holy places in Jerusalem is beginning to become more of an international point of concern and encounter. And I think there's something connected between these two periods in time. And I wanted to try and set this out. So the status quo is a very interesting point. What I think is, for a historian, quite interesting, how the idea of the status quo, which was very much centered on relations between Christians, has generally been moving towards how you keep up the idea of the status quo, how you create space for two different traditions often to share the same space, is increasingly being re-articulated in the relationship between the three religious traditions. And I think that's a moment of historical change, and the historical perspective gives us that, I think.
See, could you please explain a bit more what the status quo is of 1850? Because you just mentioned it, but it's good to explain exactly what it means.
The status quo was negotiated between the churches and the larger powers. You remember the European powers and the United States all felt that they had a role in not just protecting their different religious communities, which they felt belonged to them, but also creating a space where the different Christian communities could find a modus vivendi that they could work with, and also they had to support the churches to find an agreement. So in 1852, a status quo arrangement was given where both the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, and the Custodia, but also some of the smaller Oriental Orthodox churches, their sharing of sacred spaces, Holy Sepulchre and other churches in Bethlehem and Nazareth, would be given in such a way that they would agree how they would conduct prayer times, liturgies. So it was a very complex negotiation. But it has proved, despite the challenges associated with the status quo, it has remained in place. And increasingly it's being, I mentioned some of the diplomatic exchanges, that increasingly it's being posited as part of international diplomatic treaties. I think that is very interesting. And the point I wanted to make is that, how do we understand the character of the status quo today, which is increasingly being re-articulated? And I'll come to this in the context of the relations between the three religious traditions that share Jerusalem. Jerusalem really is unique, and how the different religious communities share holy place sites has real international significance.
Okay, thank you. Now, any questions can be made. If you want to speak in Italian, please do, and I'll translate for him.
Just wanted to note before questions, welcome our good friend and Turkish ambassador for the Holy See, who himself is a theologian and Muslim theologian. I'd like to pose a question tonight. You touched on some important moments that give a certain hope to the possibility of Jerusalem. But you very, I shouldn't say but, I should say and, you very skillfully did not address the questions of the politics, international politics. Pope Francis is one who says that in the Middle East right now is the Third World War. And there's a certain sense when you see the number of countries that are involved, that have a stake in the Middle East right now. The Middle East cannot resolve its own situations because of the interference of so many countries. And I'm wondering if it isn't something similar in Jerusalem. Many of the patriarchs throughout the Middle East are good friends, if not students, of the Orientali, and they have said to us that the war is what brought about ecumenism among us. So that the devil's question is, does there have to be a war in Jerusalem before there will be peace?
I hope not. That's the short answer. Jerusalem really does challenge the international community. And I didn't want to get into the politics of it all. Pope Francis is absolutely right, and the patriarchs, that you can't really avoid it. However, Jerusalem really does posit challenges which are just not solely articulated in the political realm. It challenges, I think, the religious communities to find a way that they can work together. I didn't get into the whole question of relations between the Jewish community and the Muslim community, because that's not my area or what I should be commenting upon. But what we can say, I think, is that for the Christian community, that Jerusalem has been a place both of international conflict, think of the 19th century, but also a way that the international order and also the churches came together to rethink the status quo. I don't want to push the status quo too far as somehow a solution. However, it does indicate that both the wider international community and the religious communities can work together to find resolutions. Anyone who looks at the modern history of Europe leading up to the First World War will know how fractious European powers were, and it led to the First World War. But also there were many voices within the wider European religious and political world who considered that their encounter in Jerusalem was a way, both in terms of scholarship, archaeology, presence, encounter, which also was very fruitful, competitive but fruitful. And I'm just wondering if we're in a moment in time now where the international community may need to draw a few historical lessons and examples of how the international community and the religious communities can work together to reflect upon the character of Jerusalem, which actually does not contribute to the scenario you set out. My other point is, and I think it's an important point, is that the Eastern Christian communities of the wider Middle East define the region differently through their complexity, but also their embeddedness in the landscape. To lose Christians from the Middle East significantly, I think, diminishes the character of the region and the character of relations between the different religious communities. I don't think we can define the Middle East region purely around the idea of one religion or one group. It's plural. And I think the Eastern Christian churches, for wider Christianity, offers an idea, a way of understanding their tradition, but also it helps us understand the character of the region. I just think it's important to bring that into the conversation around Jerusalem itself, because they're connected. Jerusalem and the region are connected.
Altre domande?
My question is a little bad, but I want to ask you how great is the probability of seeing your proposition about the status quo in 1855 realized now by the protagonist of life in Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if it was an absolute proposition. It was a historical description, and that's the way I posit it. The sharing of the sacred spaces in Jerusalem is not going to go away. Finding creative solutions to that question remains a very important current issue. It's an alive issue. And anyone who's been to Jerusalem a number of times will get a real sense of the intensity that question poses. So all I was trying to do was pull out of history an idea where the Christian communities have, on the whole, with difficulties, been able to share sacred space, which in many ways is scattered sovereignty. They change at different moments in time during the prayer times of the day or liturgies given. And on the whole, it's worked. It hasn't been perfect, but it's worked. I think also on top of that, we have a growing ecumenical idea amongst the Christian communities, which is reinforcing that idea. That's not straightforward, but I think we're finding a coincidences or convergence of different ideas of historical forces, which is reinforcing the importance that Jerusalem has for the Christian community. So how they relate to each other is important. Also, if we're having the modern religious leadership for the Christian churches, every time we have a new pope who goes to Jerusalem, goes to resource themselves or feed at the sources of the Christian tradition, and increasingly other religious leaders within the Christian context doing that. Now, I think that's a real witness to the age we're living in. So it's not a proposition, it's a description. And my question is, really, are we living in an age now where we're trying to chart some of the possibilities of how not just the Christian communities work together, but is there something for the wider religious landscape that needs to be acknowledged?
You've mentioned this need for connections between the city of Jerusalem and the Christians there and the wider Christian communities of the Middle East, and it made me think of some of these issues that have arisen because of political conflicts between the state of Israel and the other Arab nations and such, thinking specifically of how those issues have affected, for instance, the ability of Christians in these other countries to travel to Jerusalem. And I'm thinking specifically of the example of the Coptic Church and the previous Pope, and is saying, well, Copts shouldn't travel there, and if they do, they have to sort of publish this apology in the newspaper, etc. And the current Pope Tawadros sort of loosening that. My question is, what do you see as the current situation in that regard of other Christians in the wider Middle Eastern area and their ability to even travel to Jerusalem and to relate to their churches in Jerusalem?
Thank you very much. I'm very much aware that conflict, nation states, borders and frontiers, in a sense, has created a division, a divide between Jerusalem and its natural Eastern Christian hinterland. I wanted to highlight that because I think it's important. And I think it's important for the character of Christianity in the wider Middle East, but also the connectedness between the question of the Christian communities in the Middle East and Jerusalem itself. It's a natural. You're right, Pope Shenouda, during his time as Patriarch, 1971 to 2012, I think possibly he's the longest living religious leader in the region, or reigning leader, was very much against any Copts making pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Tawadros II went to Jerusalem. The Maronite Patriarch has gone to Jerusalem. I wonder if we're beginning to see that the patriarchal leadership, the leadership of the Christian churches in the Middle East, seeking to reconnect with Jerusalem through their own personal pilgrimage. It's not straightforward, as you rightly say, for Chaldeans to visit Iraq, from Iraq to visit Jerusalem, or Syrian Christians to visit Jerusalem. But I think what the patriarchs are beginning to set out by their visits, we've got the ecumenical patriarch, we've got the modern popes, we've got the Maronite patriarch, Patriarch Taldrus, and you remember Patriarch Taldrus represents the largest Christian church within the Middle East itself, saying actually we want to go to Jerusalem. So I wonder if they're beginning to weave a web of possibilities. Father David mentioned the possibility of wider conflict, which presents more problems, but I do think we need to recover the imagination, or reimagine the connectedness between Christianity and the wider Middle East and Jerusalem. I think it's important.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful presentation, a very nuanced presentation. One of my good friends is a Syriac Orthodox priest who was born and raised in the Tur Abdin, southeastern Turkey area. He spent also significant amounts of time in Jerusalem as well. In talking to him about the general situation of Christianity in the Middle East, he described it to me in a very interesting way. He said, what the Christians face is like they're being squeezed by a three-headed Siamese triplet reticulated python. I shall not go ahead and describe. I think everyone can guess. Well, I'll tell you. The Judaism, Islam, and the third head being commercial interests. And so, and he said it's a slow squeeze. A slow squeeze. Considering the very interesting phrase that you used, depluralization, what would you say, and with the inevitable fact of the slow decrease in the Christian population in the Middle East, especially in Jerusalem, where do you see is the role of at least the heads of churches in trying to address this inevitable reality and the inevitable consequences that we can all foresee?
Well, thank you very much. You raised many important themes there. One, Christianity has never just considered the Holy Land as a place of sanctuaries and holy sites. What I think is really quite interesting is how many of the ecclesial communities in Jerusalem their origins are monastic. Monasticity is about presence, but also about embedding yourself in the landscape and finding not just spiritual nourishment there, but reflecting on the character of faith within a particular context. I think that's an important way of reflecting an ascetic understanding of the character of presence in the land. As we know, Christianity has not been very articulate in describing a theology of the land, particularly in the context of the Holy Land of Jerusalem. And one of the, I suppose you could say, the learning experience and challenges to Christianity in Jerusalem, but in the wider context, is how do Christians reflect upon the Jewish idea of land or the Muslim idea of sacred space? How does that generate theological thought within the Christian community, which helps, in a sense, frame the possibility, or in a sense pushes back against the possibility, that you may not have any Christians apart from a few holy place communities left within the city. Holy places, places of sacredness, cannot continue, you could say, very long without presence. Presence is so important. And that's why I wonder, part of being in an academic institution like the Pontifical Oriental Institute is to think creative thoughts theologically within the context of where we are today. And it occurs to me that the Christian churches, in a broad sense, have the capacity and the historical tradition to rethink the idea of presence. And I don't mean just monastic, but some of that idea, the ascetic element of presence within the context of the Holy Land and Jerusalem. I think it's a real challenge to the Christian community to do that. And frankly, most of the Christian communities in the Middle East, not all, but many, or in Jerusalem, are seeing a constant hemorrhaging of some younger people or people, the community is getting thinner. And that means that, it seems to me, there's a real responsibility on the wider Christian churches, both East and West, to help the Christian communities in Jerusalem rethink the importance of presence. So I would say the question of land and presence, especially articulated by the Jewish and the Muslim community, is something the Christian community needs to take, I think, a little bit more seriously and reflect upon. And if we feel that our theology, our ecclesial character is lacking in that regard, or needs to be challenged, I think we need to take up that challenge. So I'd say Jerusalem is also a learning experience encounter for wider Christianity around the Jewish idea of the sacredness and the Muslim idea of the sacredness. And surely that should be a mutual challenge to each other to reconfigure Christian ideas around presence and land.
Ci ha parlato dei luoghi santi, però c'è una dissimmetria straordinaria tra una parte il luogo santo, i luoghi santi per i cristiani, e dall'altra parte il luogo santo per l'Islam e per gli ebrei a Gerusalemme, perché c'è il Tempio e la moschea al-Aqsa e l'altra, una parte, e dall'altra parte i luoghi santi cristiani, soprattutto come il padre Farrugia ce l'ha menzionato all'inizio, Gesù è morto, è stato sepolto e risorto fuori dalla città, poi di fatti è un'altra cosa. Allora come riflettere questa dissimmetria anche quando dobbiamo parlare di Gerusalemme?
Professor Louisier has asked this question. You have spoken of holy places, but holy places mean something different for Christians, for Jews, and for Muslims. For example, the Jews have their temple, and we know that they are constantly trying. It's no longer there, but that's a problem. Therefore, at any rate, the main question he asked is, you have to distinguish between the different meaning of holy places when we speak of holy places in Jerusalem.
No, c'è una cosa che non ha... il luogo santo, anche per gli musulmani, è esattamente sul Tempio. I nostri luoghi santi non sono sulla stessa cosa. Allora, io ho l'impressione che anche per gli ebrei, i musulmani, i luoghi santi cristiani sono altri. Invece il grosso problema è che per le due altri monoteismi è lo stesso posto. Sì. Quindi questo è importante. Prego, se puoi tradurre.
La differenza tra il luogo santo per gli ebrei...
Qual è il luogo santo? Allora, chiediamo qui. qual è il luogo santo per gli ebrei a Gerusalemme, per eccellenza?
Ecco, what is the holy place for Jews par excellence in Jerusalem?
Well, it's the temple.
Allora, e per i musulmani?
And for the Muslims?
It's Haram al-Sharif. And there
E
is
dove si trova?
Where is this place
well,
found?
in the old city of Jerusalem.
And
Um,
for Christians?
Sì. Allora c'è una dissimmetria tra le due cose, da una parte i cristiani e dall'altra parte i musulmani, gli ebrei. Allora come riflettere questa dissimmetria?
There is a lack of symmetry
Mm.
between these three concepts. As the Christians, I mean, where is their holy place? And
I think the question is a very important question because you're saying, well, it's not equal. These are not, they don't share a common idea of the sacred. That's true. The three different traditions come up to the idea of the sacred differently. They have different conceptions of the idea of God. Hence, they will understand the idea of the sacred very, very differently. That said, their relationship, there'll be many people who've been to Jerusalem here. Jerusalem is a very small place. The coexistence and living next to each other does create both different ideas of the sacred, which I think is absolutely right, but also it provokes challenges to how you share a space where the different ideas of holiness coexist together. And so while we may reflect upon the character of the sacredness to parts of Jerusalem from the Jewish tradition or the Muslim tradition, and how that generates Christian ideas around sacred sites, but also what it does generate, I think, are important theological considerations, religious considerations, how different sites, different ideas of the sacred, in a sense, cohabit together, because they are cohabiting it together. So surely one of the challenges is not just how we define sacred sites, which I think is very important, and also is one that I think is full of profound religious exchange. Exchanging ideas on the character of the holy is important, but it does posit this question: how do you develop categories of religious thought that allow different ideas of the sacred to cohabit in one space? Because I think that's what we are looking at. Okay? So I think that's in a sense, there are two parts of this question. One is a profound idea of differenceness. We understand the character of different sacred spaces. Two, I think, it's how that character of sacred space actually feeds into the different religious imaginations of the different respective traditions. And I think the third point is how do they develop theological space, religious space, where you can share different ideas of the sacred. I think that is a challenge. And maybe I was trying to set some of that out in a historical perspective. However, but that is the nub of the question. So thank you very much.
My question, I think, is in connection. In the New Testament, especially in John's Gospel, in the conversation that Jesus has with the Samaritan woman at the well, he says that people will no longer worship in Jerusalem, but in spirit. And so my question is, because I think he's right, there is a distinction in the way Jews see the Holy Land and the way Christians do. And it seems to me like Christians have more likening to the Levites, whose inheritance was God. However, it seems to me that Christians also, because the covenant between Christ and God was made in Jerusalem. It seems to be an important place to me as well. However, the question I have is then, what do you think the Christian relationship with the Jews in reference to how to share the Holy Land in a peaceful way should be? Because it seems to me like that's going to be very difficult, because when both religions take their faith seriously, the concept of the land is very different. Does that make sense?
It does. Again, thank you for the question. I don't want to cut up the Holy Land in Jerusalem in too many parts, but there is a question, and a wider political religious question, of how Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians share what you might describe as the wider Holy Land. I think there's, and that starts to take in many different variables. When you're sharing, and I don't want to take Jerusalem out of that equation, out of the concept of the Holy Land in a wider sense. It's slightly artificial, but just to be helpful, I think it takes us part of the way. The Jerusalem itself, the old city of Jerusalem, and I think it's very difficult. Traditionally, many political religious thinkers have always felt that Jerusalem needs a wider hinterland to continue to sustain the religious communities in Jerusalem, and that's an obvious fact. You asked this other question: what can Jews and Christians learn, or Christians learn, from the Jewish idea of the sacredness? I think that's a profoundly difficult question, because, as we know, Christianity doesn't have the same idea of the sacredness in that character. And otherwise, Christianity, you could say, Christianity has become this intensely global religious tradition. And in a sense, it's taken the idea of Jerusalem or Antioch and made it a global reality. As I mentioned in my talk, I do think we're living in quite an extraordinary age for global Christianity, where you have this vast juggernaut of a religious tradition spread right across the world. However, in the Middle East, it's really a declining part of that. And for me, there's a challenge to Christianity. So I suppose my question is, this global Christian reality which lives outside of Jerusalem, how does it rethink itself through the situation of Christianity in the wider Middle East or in Jerusalem? And I'm not sure if I or any of us have really thought that through. However, there are a number of things, aren't there? Christianity in Jerusalem is intensely plural. They represent a wide range of different histories, traditions, communities right across the world. They are intimately linked also with the Eastern Christian world, but also the Christian world, the Eastern Christian world of the Middle East. So I think there's an element for us to reflect upon there. I think there is a future challenge of how we reflect upon the character of the whole of sacredness in conversation with other religious traditions. I think Christianity as a tradition lives in history. That's why we have councils. We have councils is a great way of looking at it, how Christianity has lived in history. And I think we're living in a historical moment where the Christian tradition needs to think about itself not just in relationship to Jerusalem, but what Jerusalem symbolizes around the character of relations with other religious traditions, but also how that is articulated in a global landscape. Because I think Jerusalem does have an influence on that. And it's not the issue of Jerusalem, how Christians, Jews and Muslims are going to share this sacred space, I think has wide influence right across the world. And I think it possibly, this is the historian speaking, saying, is there something from the 19th century that we can learn from today? Is there a coincidence? Is there a convergence of different historical epochs where international relations and the idea of religion in the modern world are coalescing around their relationship in Jerusalem? So the challenge is, if it's sacred, how do you share sacredness? If you have different forms of sacredness, how do they cohabit together?
Una osservazione, non una domanda. Una osservazione, non una domanda. Vorrei insieme a voi tornare 800 anni fa. 800 anni fa. Quando un povero religioso italiano parte con la quinta crociata e arriva ad Damietta, dove, come diceva padre Farrugia prima di questa relazione, proprio lì dove c'è il conflitto nasce la pace. Francesco d'Assisi, 800 anni fa, nel massimo del conflitto tra i musulmani e le truppe che venivano dall'Occidente, no? Riesce a fare un dialogo di pace e di amore. Noi abbiamo parlato dello status quo, dove purtroppo non si fa altro che rivendicare i propri diritti e nei luoghi più sacri per la cristianità, i cristiani si picchiano anche per avere mezz'ora di più o mezz'ora di meno in una cerimonia o dire una messa fuori programma. Penso che bisogna tornare a questa storia per ricordare che il nostro status quo è il Vangelo. Penso che i cristiani devono, le chiese, i patriarchi, le nostre autorità devono smettere di fare guerra per rivendicare i diritti, ma pensare al Vangelo e pensare al cristianesimo in questi luoghi dove noi francescani lì rischiamo di essere lì custodi delle pietre, e penso non è questo il ruolo della Chiesa, di difendere delle pietre e dello status quo, ma essere testimoni del Vangelo, e per esserlo dobbiamo avere lo spirito del Vangelo che porta alla pace. Grazie.
Father raised the question about peace. He says 800 years ago, Saint Francis, risking everything, went to the Sultan and managed to find an accord from which we have the custodia ultimately. And he says, therefore, he speaks about the Franciscans, and therefore it's not my criticism. He says that we Franciscans are in danger of protecting stones instead of preaching the gospel. And therefore we have to see how important it is that to find a solution, it's not the status quo which is going to help us, it's the gospel.
I could say yes. I think we started to think, didn't we? Well, we have different ideas of sacred spaces and sacred, and so Christians bring a different idea of the sacredness to the shrines. And you're right, there are the whole questions. Do you go on your pilgrimage to return to the world? Do you preach to the world after you? And pilgrimage has been a very strong sense of that. And so I think you're correct. St. Francis, as we know, can be interpreted in many different ways, and his encounter with the Sultan and such like. But what he felt, I suppose, I'm not putting the shoes of St. Francis, St. Francis sought to engage with another religious tradition without neglecting his own. And that goes back to this question that how do we participate in multiple sacred ideas in relationship to creating, you could say, peace, but creating a living space that people feel that they can own something, but not totalize something, but also share something, which actually allows for the possibility of exchange. That's why I do think for Christianity, there's a real challenge to understand the character of the sacredness both for Jews and for Muslims. And that's an open-ended engagement. I mentioned Lev Gillet, who's a very well-known Eastern Orthodox thinker, who was one of the first to write a book on Judaism and reflect upon the character of Judaism and Jerusalem in the modern context. And he wrote this book in 1943. He was taken very strongly by the mystical idea of the character of presence for Judaism. And he took those ideas in after the Second World War in his very important and influential dialogue with the Church of Antioch. So he was one, and I think we haven't, in a sense, developed our knowledge of Lev Gillet. Bernard Dupuy, who was the editor of Istina, wrote a very long article about Lev Gillet. It's about how he learnt from the ideas of sacred, but took this into his ecumenical relations between the different Christian communities. So there's another issue here, I think, actually, is how do we continually reflect on the character of the sacred as understood by other religious traditions, mediate that in a historical context where Christianity engages with a sense of renewing itself, I think is an interesting and an important question.
Well, Father Rector is politely but firmly intimating that the hour has come. So let's thank those whom we should thank. I start this time with Father Rector because he promoted this speaker, and he was very much in favor, and without his help we cannot do anything here. And then I thank also Dr. Borgia, who in many ways, we know Nicoletta, she is working behind the scenes, and she deserves also a word of sincere thanks. But of course, I thank, as last person to thank, the speaker, Professor Anthony O'Mahony. The number of questions, like a small Pentecost almost, of inquisitiveness, have been a sign of the effectiveness of your talk, for which we give you a big applause. Now, please, in your enthusiasm for Jerusalem, don't forget that there is something waiting for you in the corridor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kyrie, que gratia prosei, Sanctus